Why is culture important? So for this class, we're going to be really focusing on culture itself and really sort of getting more into depth about what culture is. So first of all, what is culture? Well, culture are the beliefs, customs, arts, language, and behavior of a particular society. Culture is also a way of thinking, behaving, or working that exists in a society, place, such as a state, or an individual community, or an organization. The pictures listed below are all representations of culture, from a practice of religious ritual to an organizing of society to the sort of beliefs of what our culture, of our nation, or of our community are. That's all part of culture. A big thing about culture is that it's first learned, meaning that nobody's born with culture. You are taught culture from a young age, and in many times subtle or in indirect ways. It is learned both consciously and unconsciously. It is taught directly as well as how you observe, and observing through your parents, through your teachers, through your religious leaders, to your political leaders as well. Culture is also very much symbolic. Cultural learning depends on the human capacity to use symbols, signs that have no necessary or natural connections they stand for or signify. So one thing that comes up to mind as symbolic is baseball and apple pie being sort of culturally American, right? Well, if you just looked at these two things separately, you could be like, how do these two things, a sport and a dessert, represent America? But if you then talk about American cultural values and society, then you sort of can talk about how these symbols represent American culture. Culture is also shared. It's transmitted orally, and as well as visually, as well as just socially in society. We learn our culture by observing, by listening, by talking and interacting with many other people. It is something that is always sort of a dynamic process, meaning that it's always being shared, being talked about in indirect and as well as direct ways. We're all involved in culture. Nobody's outside of culture. We're all kind of in the soup. So again, culture is all encompassing as well as it happens every day. So cultural forces are those that affect people every day in their lives. Culture is a part of our everyday lives. Culture is also integrated and it changes, meaning that they change through time, and they are also heavily affected by changing economic or political forces. So don't think of culture as something that just stands in place, right? Again, because it's sort of this dynamic process, meaning that it's constantly being sort of shaped by the people living in that culture, it's always changing a bit. And you can talk about it today, even in American society, about how American culture has changed from your parents' generation from your grandparents' generation, from your great-grandparents' generation. You know that culture is a dynamic process, meaning that it changes. Culture is also very sort of instrumental, adaptive, and maladaptive, meaning that cultural traits are instrumental to how societies adapt to their environment, and culture determines a group's continued existence. Some cultural traits can be adaptive, meaning that it's helping that these cultural sort of practices, beliefs, rituals help people sort of survive or adapt to a changing environment, as well as some can be very maladaptive, meaning that it causes this community to either have to change completely or actually go extinct. And cultures have gone extinct, so it's something that does happen. But, I think that for a lot of us, culture seems a little bit abstract in thinking. You think, oh, culture, what is that? Is that violins and I don't know, opera? Like you think of culture in that way. But culture can be anything from sort of that, yeah, violins and opera, to also just sort of the way that we talk about beauty. What do we think is beautiful? And so I'm going to give you an example, and hopefully it fleshes out what I mean by culture. Is in the U.S. society, especially really particularly if young girls in the America, is the culture of thinness in America. So let's talk about thinness, or the sort of maybe you could call obsession at times with thinness in America, and the way our culture has put symbolic value to thinness. And let's talk about how this sort of symbolic meaning to thinness has real consequences. So, for most living in America, being thin was taught from an early age, both directly and indirectly, as an ideal form of beauty and importance, particularly to young girls, but also young boys have been affected by thinness. Thinness has sort of a symbolic value to it. By being thin, you are seen as more attractive to other persons. Thinness also sort of can be seen in many circumstances as a sign of wealth, of higher class, being actually smart. I mean, if you think about it, the most sort of like top and beautiful people that may be in American society, such as, let's say, movie stars, well, they're all thin and they all have these glamorous life, right? So we kind of also equate that glamorous life to their body size. So it's a way of like a shared thing, meaning that it's not just one person sort of pushing thinness on America. I mean, yes, you can talk about the media, but the media is informed by us, everyone around it, right? So it's a shared thing, whether it's our parents, from kids in school, from magazines, it's always shared. And thinness, in the discussion of sort of the pressure of thinness, as well as the discussion of thinness, as well as sort of the values behind thinness, we encounter them every day, right? Like if you go to Myers or if you go to Walmart and you go check out, you buy whatever your food for the day, you're going to see ads for diet and exercise equipment on the racks, as well as on the magazine racks, as well as, when you're watching TV, when you're looking at Facebook. And, again, going back to movie stars, when we watch movies, we see thin actors, right? We see thin actors and thin actresses in romantic roles as action stars or as living this wealthy upper elite lifestyle. It's also very integrated, right? Like, so a lot of times we don't even realize about thinness in the sense of, or maybe some of us really realize it, but sometimes we just do it without thinking about sort of enforcing thinness as a sign of beauty and all these other values to it. So, one thing is that, with thinness, it could be even just our everyday interactions with people. So, such as me going to work and saying, Sheila, you look great. Have you lost weight? That's being pretty integrated, right? But also, it's kind of important that thinness has changed through time. So, meaning, and what I mean by thinness is sort of like thinness as being a sign of attractiveness, right? And in fact, it also changes through time, but it changes also across communities and cultures. And even differs between particular communities within the United States. So in the 1950s, a more voluptuous body size was seen as far more attractive. But now today, there is this sort of pressure for attractive thinness, of like extreme thinness, of being very, very thin. So no more of the voluptuous curves or anything like that. And, the culture of in America is both adaptive. So, I mean, yeah, it's healthy to be thin. Thinness is also a sign of health, meaning that you're exercising, you're eating well, you're not overeating. And so there's nothing actually really wrong with being thin. But at the same time, it can be a very maladaptive, right? To malnutrition, low self-esteem, poor health, and unfortunately deaths of young girls and young boys. So thinness is a cultural product that made by, especially within American society, and it affects how people live their daily lives, like from the food that you eat to your exercise to how you feel when you go out going grocery store shopping, right? Like, so again, culture is something that is part of that is not just one thing. It's also can be this thing of thinness. Thinness is a culture. What we think is beautiful is a culture product. It's important though when you talk about culture, especially when you're talking about culture in comparisons to other cultures, that you sort of be really specific in what you're saying. So when I talked about thinness being a cultural product, I'm not saying that everyone across the United States is affected by thinness in this exact same way or holds the same beliefs about this. In fact, there's a lot of variation in that. As well as I couldn't say that, oh, thinness is being the sign of utmost beauty and importance across cultures, meaning that, there are many cultures where thinness is seen as a sign of poor health, right? So again, when we think about sort of cultural sort of beliefs and practices, don't think of them as universal. Think of them that many of them are very particular. But there are things that maybe are universal. So meaning that they're found in every culture. But they're going to be different in the sense that, yeah, there might be such as differences in age from there's a child age, then you become an adult, and then you become an elderly person or an elder. But the meanings behind those ages and all even sort of the sort of social sort of pattern behind how a person transitions from a child to an elder are going to be very sort of particular to that community. So, but there are universals in the sense that there are differences in age in most societies that have sort of a sort of a differing or sort of a separating of people from different ages of their life stage. So from child, adult, elder. But they're going to be different and very particular to that community as well. General is sort of common to most cultures, so differences in gender. And we're going to be having a lecture on gender in a couple weeks, so keep this in the back of your hat in the sense that, yeah, most communities have sort of gender sort of differences, meaning there's maybe a male, female, or third gender or something like that. But again, it's going to be very community specific of the meanings behind those genders, what does a proper woman do? What does a proper man do? What is beautiful? What is not beautiful in each gender? All of that, right? It's going to be very specific. We can say that commonly across most cultures in the world, there are differences in gender. And again, then, particular. It's going to be unique to certain cultures. And some cultures have very unique practices that are not shared by anyone, which also makes it very interesting to study them to understand why do they do the things they do. One example is eating pork, though, you could also say that that's generally shared by both many other sort of communities, but, you could say that it is particular to that community. There are other things as well that you could go into. And as we read through the culture texts, you'll see sort of the particularities of each community as well as sort of the general things that a lot of them do share. But again, it's always good to be sort of really careful on how you sort of make generalizations about communities and culture. So let's talk about the individual in culture. So as much as culture is all encompassing, meaning that, it's all encompassing in the sense that it's the soup that we swim in, it's the water, it's the air that we breathe, right? Nobody's outside of culture. That doesn't mean that culture is sort of this thing where it's kind of like quicksand where you can't ever get out and you don't have any choice and you're sort of a victim to it, or that you don't have any sort of free will. People do have free will, and that's called agency. And agency at the core it's the ability to act, right? To make an action, whether that's to move forward, move back, to say yes, say no, whatever. That's an act. And we are all actors. So it is by our actions that we also shape culture. So that's why culture is a dynamic process, meaning that it's always changing, because we as actors are changing it by our individual actions. Again, culture is not stagnant. It's it is again a social product, and as actors we can definitely contest certain aspects or meanings of culture. We can also directly or indirectly change culture through our everyday actions. Again, we are actors and culture is both sort of informs us as well as we are informing culture. So we're shaping it as well as culture shaping us. So it's a very dynamic relationship going on. Culture is both public and individual, both in the world as well as in our minds. Okay? So it's important when investigating a particular culture, we look at not only sort of the larger cultural practices, but how do individuals feel, think about certain actions, beliefs, practices, and how they also act. And maybe even how they also act to change them or how they act to sort of reinforce them. Culture affects each of us differently, depending on our social position. And I think that's really important. So, what is social position? Social position is sort of where we are in that particular society, meaning like that's determined by our race, by our class, our geographical or national location. So, living in the United States is a particular social position. Also, our religion, our sexuality, our gender, our age, as well as sort of our ability, if we're disabled or not, and how we can sort of experience certain sort of parts of culture and symbols of culture depend on our social positioning. So some of us might be more of in a privileged position because of our race or our gender or our sexuality or also a combination of all of that, and can maybe have more sort of action to resist or to enforce certain cultural rules, patterns, or beliefs. And so it's always really important to say that, again, culture is not this monolithic thing where, we're all sort of being under the sort of the cultural chains. All of us deal with it very differently. And in that difference, that's where that sort of dynamic process happens, where culture does change and we change as well. Okay, so this is the end of the lecture, and we're just going to go through the key terms again. So, key terms for this lecture will be agency. And agency is going to be something we're going to be talking about a lot in this course. So, it's good to have a definition, and the definition for this will be the ability for persons to act. The next one is social position. It is the position of an individual in a given society and culture. And we're going to talk more about social position, but it's good to have these two right now and a firm understanding of it. Okay, thanks so much, and I'll see you next class.